the Giving Voice podcast.
It's our first episode of 2025. New year, same us. It is still me, Nathalie.
And me, Issy.
If, like us, you're feeling a bit blue about the cold British weather and dark evenings and mornings, this is the episode for you.
Today, we're talking about working abroad as a speech and language therapist. We'll be speaking to an SLT who has moved to work in the UK and an SLT who has moved from the UK to work abroad.
You might recognise Carly Simonaitis from episode 18, where we heard about her life as a specialist SLT in deafness, who is now going to share her words of wisdom about working abroad and her journey from the US to the UK.
And we also speak to Sara Knight, live from Hamburg over Teams. Sara is an SLT who actually graduated from UCL, just like Carly, and then moved to Germany to work.
Right, let's get started. Hi Carly, welcome back to the Giving Voice podcast. It's so great that you could join us again for our episode on working abroad.
I'm so pleased to be here. So thank you for
So
having
great to
me.
have you again.
I'm so excited to nitpick your brains today because I'm so interested in working abroad. I did a year abroad in Italy and I'd love to go back. So I think there'll be lots of other student speech and language therapists who feel very similarly. So I think this will be a really exciting episode.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. I'm not necessarily that interested in going abroad myself. I think I want to stay in the UK, but I'm just super excited to just hear about your experience and what opportunities are available for speech therapists. Who knows, maybe in the future I will want to go abroad.
Yeah, I'll try to be convincing in this.
Yeah, my mind might be changed by the end.
So I think it's probably best to start with you, Carly. So could you just give us your whole background on how you got here today?
Sure. And another thank you for having me speak about this, because I think so often for a clinical healthcare role, it can feel like you can't take that title abroad, but you definitely can. And I've seen that you can. I'm somewhat of the proof you can do such a thing too.
Yeah.
But you asked a little bit about who I am and where I've come from. So my accent's giving it away. I am from the United States, originally from Chicago, born and bred. All my family is based over there. So my background here, how did I wind up in the UK? Well, it wasn't originally intended. I did my undergraduate studies in speech and hearing science in the United States at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Over there, we do a major and a minor. So my major was in speech and hearing science, and my minor was in French. And after a semester studying abroad in Paris, I had fallen in love with it, and I just wanted to go back to France and pursue that French studies. I wanted to learn how to really speak the language. Went over there. I was teaching in the public schools in Paris as an English teacher. I loved it, and I also got stuck into the expat community while out there. And part of that expat community included speech and language therapists from New Zealand, from Australia, from the United States. And it was really this organization that was put together to help with expat families who would come to Paris. They had a family. Their kids starting to grow up, and they're noticing some delays or difficulties, and they need a speech and language therapist. And they would like that in their home language.
Yeah.
And so I got stuck in with a speech and language therapist, Grace, who once upon a time I did interview for this Giving Voice podcast in my era too. So her voice is on here somewhere in the archives. But I was helping her. I was her speech and language therapist assistant, and I was giving bilingual support. But I was doing that work. My visa was starting to run up. And so what do I do next? And the idea of, do I go and do speech and language therapy master's program in France in the French language? Or do I do it in English?
Yeah.
Because always in the back of my mind, I was trying to keep my doors open as wide as possible for whatever may happen in the future. So even though I wasn't really ready to leave Paris, I started to explore speech and language therapy master's programs in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
And I needed a master's because if I ever were to go back to the United States, you need a master's in order to practice as a speech language pathologist. So I was like, okay, to keep all my options open, let's go to the UK. I applied to all different schools, and it was UCL that I was like, yeah, I think this fits the bill. And that's how I wound up in the UK to start with, is that I wanted to get my master's degree in the English language to keep doors open in the future.
And what made you decide to do the graduate program in the UK rather than in the US?
I feel like it links back to my love of France, which maybe is broader to the love of Europe and being on this side of the world. I had been living in France, loved it. I guess I was coming into adulthood then, if you will. Like I arrived over here when I was 22 to this side of the world, and I was learning how to be an adult over here. And I don't know, I think that kind of played into, I just kind of was getting used to things. And to go back to the United States, love my friends and family back home, absolutely. But I wasn't ready to give up this European life that I was building for myself. Yeah. And so to go across the channel to London, that's a lot smaller of a distance than to go back across the Atlantic Ocean. Definitely. Yeah. So I think that's a bit wide. But the course itself wasn't going to be that vastly different from one another. Okay. So I guess the other motivation was, okay, yes, I could go to the US and do the course over there, but what I'm going to be learning is very similar. And there's this thing called the Mutual Recognition Agreement. That's something between the RCSLT from the United Kingdom, then you have ASHA in the United States. So amongst English-speaking countries, your degree is transferable. I see. There's a paperwork trail, but it can be transferable. And so that just kind of added to my backpack of reasons why I'm going to stay over here of, sure, why not? Let's do it here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that agreement, so is it fine as it is with your degree, or do you need to do additional red tape?
Yeah, there's always a little bit of red tape somewhere, the United States included. So if I wanted to go back to the United States, yes, I have my master's degree, but I would also need to take an exam upon arrival. Right, okay. As far as I've understood and am aware of, that I would have to take something called the praxis exam. So it's almost another examination to make sure you do have all the knowledge of being a speech and language therapist. We see you have your international degree, we see you have whatever years of work experience, but you also have to take this exam.
Okay. Oh, I see.
Yeah. So, and then your state license as well. So there's different bits.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I think that sometimes can start to sound like a barrier to people bringing their SLT career overseas, because there is red tape and there is this bureaucracy that comes with it, but it's not impossible to navigate. It might not be easy, but this is why there are Facebook groups, networks online that can help get through this, because it is possible to go and take your career abroad.
Yeah. Amazing.
So was it your love for Europe that encouraged you to stay and actually get a job here as a newly qualified therapist? Or were there other reasons why you chose to stay?
Both. There was both. I would say that, I didn't want to go back away anywhere immediately following the course. Yeah. But that was also logistical, because when you first finish the course here in the United Kingdom, you have this clinical competency year, your newly qualified therapist year. And if I had gone straight from my master's program to the United States, there was going to be a lot of justification involved. Justification like, oh, how many hours did I work in dysphagia? How many hours was I working with selective mutism? Whatever it was, like you had to really quantify things. Whereas if you did your year, or however long it took you to complete your newly qualified therapist year, that signed off, you wouldn't have to be justifying yourself quite as much.
So it's a lot would have been a smoother transition.
Yes, I found that to be the case, because I did speak to a woman who she had to go back to the United States immediately following the course, and it was a lot more complicated. There was even more paperwork to be dealing with.
I see. That makes sense. And as an international student, how did you find the process of applying for a job? So obviously you studied at UCL. Do you think having the UK degree actually helped, or? And how do you think the process would be different with a qualification from abroad?
I think there is something to applying for a visa, a UK visa, whilst you're in the UK. It is processed slightly differently. The magic behind the scenes, what exactly happens, I'm not sure. But all I can say is I've always had a very quick turnaround applying for a health and care worker visa. Which is like almost an NHS specific visa. Applying for that while in the UK, it's always been a very fast turnaround. Whereas as I've understood anecdotally, if you're applying from outside the UK, it could take longer to kind of get an answer. But speech and language therapists are in demand here in the United Kingdom, so it's not to inhibit anybody if they're wanting to apply from abroad, but the processing time may take longer, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And also, speaking about your love for France and for Europe, would you ever consider going back to France?
Ooh, good question. I like that.
Well, I never say never. I would say it was such a cool experience to see that type of work that's available as a speech and language therapist. It's vastly different than working in the NHS, the National Health Service. How that service worked there, because it was a private clinic and it was families directly reaching out. You're doing home visits, really involving the parents all right there. Sometimes we would be working in a shared clinic space with an American occupational therapist, and we would have joint sessions right there, like in the same room. So there's a lot of really cool collaboration because the setting was different and the approach was a little bit different versus here in my current role working in mainstream primary and secondary schools. You're in the school system, whereas in France, there are not speech and language therapists in the schools. So the settings are different. I don't know. So who's to say? But I really loved my experience working as an SLTA in France. So as an SLT, I think I'd love that too.
Amazing.
Are there any other countries that you would be interested in working as an SLT?
I know my family keep hoping I'll say the United States, but I think the only two places that I really consider working as a SALT as of right now would be either here in England or in France. So.
Okay.
Yes.
And finally, what's your best tip for an international therapist wanting to work in the UK?
I would recommend, and this is going to be my general tip, and it comes in, I guess, two parts, of getting stuck in. And when I say get stuck in, it is just trying to get yourself as enmeshed or embedded into the possible situation of what would your setting look like if you were to come over to the UK. It's, I guess, having an understanding of what does the National Health Service look like. So if you want to be on that visa, what is that really going to entail? How is that going to impact the setting you work in, expectations with the people you work with, even your salary as well? This can be different. So it's thinking, how can you get stuck in? I like to recommend where it's possible to go to the place 2-3 weeks, like to properly imagine what would it be like to really live here, and use things like Facebook groups, find the like the RCSLT, the ASHA, whatever that professional organization is, find them, talk to them, show them your qualifications, see what the differences are. And then once you know, okay, that sounds about right, narrowing down the setting and brushing up on your terminology about the setting, because like a school in France or the United States, they used completely different terminology than what they would here in the UK.
Yeah.
So you're familiar about that, because your interview questions are going to involve that type of terminology, so you need to know what these things are.
Yeah.
So getting stuck in, and the power of a cold email. Just reach out to people.
Yeah.
Speech and language therapists, we're a very friendly bunch, and we want to help each other, honestly. I think I've gotten as far as I have in other countries because of cold emails and people wanting to help out, and they'll give you that direct experience or hot tips of, look out for this. Oh, can support with this. Oh, I could give you an observation or a placement where you can gain some of that experience that you need. So being bold, get stuck in, and send a cold email would be my tips.
Amazing. I'm definitely going to start looking at some Facebook groups as well.
Ooh, where will you end up?
Italy.
Amazing.
I'm going to have to brush up on my Italian though, for sure.
Yeah, you have a year, at least 2 years.
No, thank you so much, Carly. It's been so helpful and lovely to have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been so great to have you back.
So happy to be here. So thank you.
Hi, Sarah. It's so great to have you here with us on the podcast today.
Hi, so lovely to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Sarah, it's right that you studied in UCL in London?
Yes, so I did my degree to train as a speech and language therapist from 2017 until 2019 at UCL.
Oh, wow. And what made you choose to come to UCL for your master's?
So I did a master's previously at the University of Edinburgh. And during that master's, I read a lot of papers studying speech and language therapy and the impact therapy has on childhood development and language development and all that. And I always felt that while those papers were really necessary, they were also very far removed from the reality. So kids would be receiving 20 hours of speech and language therapy input per week. I was like, what happens in reality? And I wanted to do something that actually would make a change. So I decided I wanted to train as a speech and language therapist. And I also met a former speech and language therapist who was a PhD student at the university. I didn't really have any practical experience in related areas. So I took a year out and I worked as a carer and I worked in a children's hospital in Glasgow. Yeah, and I worked as a volunteer with stroke survivors. And then I literally applied to every university in the UK. Wow. And after my interview at UCL, I was offered a place to study, and then I just took it.
Yeah, that's so nice. And so now you're working as a speech and language therapist in Germany, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, and so what was the process like of applying for jobs in Germany with a speech and language therapy qualification from the UK?
So before I even started the formal process, I looked at job offers online for speech and language therapists in Germany. In Germany, they're called Logopäde.
Yeah.
And there's different areas you can work in. And there was one job ad that stood out to me because it was very different from the other ones, was very transparent about what was expected of you and what benefits you would receive for working for this particular practice. And I just emailed the practice lead and I said, hey, I live in the UK, I am German, but I have studied in the UK and I've worked here. Would you even consider employing me or someone like me?
Yeah.
Yes, of course I would. If you go through the formal process and we get the okay, I would be happy to employ you. And I was like, okay, brilliant. I then came over to Germany just to, look for flats and figure things out. And I went to the practice and I got to meet the other ladies who worked there and the practice lead. And we had an informal chat and she said, if you're back in Hamburg again, let me know. So we also had a Skype chat as well, but it was very informal. And then on the second time I visited, she asked me, when can you start? So I never really had an interview. And I think that is one of the reasons why that practice stood out to me, because it was doing it differently.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And so did you need any extra competencies to take this job in Germany, or did they just take your qualification from UCL?
So this is where things get really complicated. So Germany is a federal state. So it's not like in the UK where if there's a rule, then it's for most of the UK. It might be different in Wales, it might be different in Scotland or Northern Ireland. But here, every county decides its own rules. So I can only tell you how it was in Hamburg.
Yeah.
Okay. Because speech and language therapy in Germany is very close to healthcare rather than education, everything is done by the healthcare department. I wrote an email to the healthcare department and I explained my situation, and they said, we're not entirely sure if we're responsible for you or if someone else is. You need to go to the other people first, say they're not responsible, then we'll look at your qualifications. And I was like, okay, well, this is not a great start. There's also not a Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. There's
Right.
lots of little groups. One of them is for academic speech and language therapists. And they actually don't call themselves Logopäde, they call themselves akademische Sprachtherapeuten. So I had to then write to that group and explain my situation again, where I'm at. Are you responsible for me? And they were like, absolutely not.
Okay.
So back I went to the healthcare department, I filled in a form, and they said, okay, we're going to have a look at it, and then we're going to find a teacher at a speech and language therapy school, or a lecturer, because it's not a university-based degree here, but they're going to go to a speech and language therapy school, and they're going to find a teacher there who's going to look at all of these things, and then they're going to decide if I need to do any more courses, or if I need to do a test, or if they're actually happy with my qualification. The teacher then says, could we actually do a Skype call? Because I don't really understand any of this. So I then looked at their curriculum. I went on the website of her school, I looked at the curriculum, and I sort of matched up all the UCL kind of fits and that kind of fits. And this, if you're really lenient, that works there, and so on. And I had the call with her, and I was prepared, and I just like told her, this is there, this is there, this is there. And she was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. I said, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty confident that I can sign us off without you doing any courses or any tests. And that was it. And then the health department sent me my degree. So now I have a German degree as well.
Okay. Wow.
Oh, wow. So how long do you think the entire process took? Because it sounds long.
It was very long. So it took about just under a year and a half.
Wow.
That's
okay.
crazy.
Yeah. Good to know for anyone who does want to go abroad. Absolutely. I think that's the key problem. It's finding the right person initially, isn't it, as well? And it varies between countries. So, yes. So how does the role of an SLT in Germany differ to the role of an SLT working in the UK?
So I worked for the NHS, and I was in a school-based service.
Mm-hmm.
So the last 2 years of my career, I worked in youth justice, and I wasn't school-based. However, that's where my trust's main focus lay, I'm going to say. We had a few practitioners who worked in hospitals with newborns, but we didn't really do stroke. So it was all developmental. However, in Germany, it's just very different. There's very few schools that have speech and language therapists.
Okay.
And you're mainly based in a practice or in a hospital or maybe in a nursery. And then you wouldn't be based in one nursery. You would have multiple nurseries that you go to on different days, or you do a half day here and a half day there. It's not as focused on education as I personally have experienced SLT to be. Again, this is just because I worked in a school-based service.
Yeah.
In Germany, being a speech and language therapist is more aligned with healthcare. So all our referrals come from doctors. You wouldn't get a referral from a school. They can't refer to a speech and language therapist unless they have their own speech and language therapist.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's interesting.
So in that way, it's very different. Another thing that is completely different to the UK is that we work on something that in German is known as a viszerales Schluckmuster, which would be a visceral swallowing pattern. That means that the child or the adult, but usually the child, pushes their tongue against their teeth while swallowing, which teeth to be pushed forward, which is not good. And you require braces to fix that.
Yeah.
You go and see a speech and language therapist who teaches you an adult swallowing pattern, and then you'll be able to maybe not need braces or need different kind of braces. This is not dysphagia, nothing to do with swallowing down here. It's literally just a tongue movement. So that's a big difference. So a lot of referrals come from dentists, orthodontists, obviously pediatricians, and ear, nose, and throat specialists. I can't remember which order it is. But
yeah. Oh, wow. So did you have to learn extra stuff about sort of braces and almost like a dentistry course you'd have in the UK?
I luckily haven't had to learn anything about braces yet.
Good.
But I did have to learn how to treat a visceral swallowing pattern, because it is how children swallow as babies. We all swallow the way, but usually you just somehow stop doing it and you swallow the right way, but a lot of kids don't.
Right. Okay.
But so that's a big difference, definitely.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
That is so interesting. Yeah.
being practice-based means your patients, not service users, their patients, they come and see you once a week, usually for 45 minutes or for 90 minutes in one-to-one, or you see them in pairs or you see them in big groups, and you see a child for as long as you think they need to be seen.
Okay.
You may have a child on the caseload for 2 sessions and say, nope, they don't need speech and language therapy, or this is not the right time. Or say, I don't think they can actually hear me. I'm only going to see them again once you've been to the ear, nose, throat specialist and you can prove to me that this child can actually hear.
Yeah.
Or they might be with you for years.
Wow.
It's totally up to you and how well you can convince the doctor to renew the referral.
Yeah, that's really nice that you can actually decide if you think a child needs longer than just the set number of sessions, that actually you can keep them on your caseload.
Downside is, though, parents do have certain expectations as well. And there's also parents who think, oh, my child's fine, they don't need this. But also because it is practice-based, it's very isolated.
Yeah.
I don't have any time in the day to call a school, talk to a teacher, talk to a different therapist, really sit down with the parents, have a good chat. Apart from the first session, if I want to do that, I have to use one of the child's sessions.
Right. Yeah. So told us all about the long process it took you to move from the UK to Germany, a year and a half. Do you know if there's anything else besides what you did that a UK national would need to do? Obviously in Hamburg.
So I've looked into it. It's so confusing.
Yeah.
So what we gathered is you can either apply for a D visa, which allows you to live and work in Germany before you move.
Yeah.
And that means from the moment the visa is granted, you are allowed to work. Or if you move to Germany without a visa, then you have to register your address. You have to do that anyway. Everyone has to register in Germany. And once you have done that, you can then apply for your visa, but it may take longer. Yeah.
Okay.
Helpful, thank you. And thank you for researching that as well.
Yeah.
You'd have to do is prove your German language levels.
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah.
And do you know what level you would need to be? I know that if it's like A1, A2
or C1, I'm not 100% sure. I should have looked it up again, sorry.
No, that's fine.
That would be the usual that you would need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess it's sort of good if anyone is thinking about moving abroad, that actually it's a long process and it's kind of good to think about things maybe a little bit in advance, do a lot of research.
Absolutely, definitely. And finally, Sara, we just wondered, what is your best tip for a therapist with a speech and language therapy qualification from the UK wanting to work abroad?
I think it's what you already said. Starting early, email people if you think they might be able to help. I think is the most important thing for you to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sara, for coming onto the podcast today. It's been so great to have you and to hear just a little bit about your journey from moving from the UK to Germany and the long process, and to hear some tips from you. It's been so great.
You're more than welcome. I hope it's helpful for someone out there.
Absolutely. No, that's great. You've definitely inspired me. I feel like I just need to now try and find the right person to speak to and then start practicing my Italian, clearly.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Carly and Sara. Clearly networking and reaching out is the way to go if you don't know where to start.
A few extra tips from us. We'll be attaching a link to the RCSLT webpage dedicated to working internationally. You just need an RCSLT login to access it.
Another key step that we found is figuring out who the professional body is for speech and language therapy in the country you want to go to, then working from there. For example, in the UK, it's RCSLT.
Finally, we'll be attaching a link to an SLT webinar run by Healthcare Abroad, which is taking place on Saturday, the 1st of February at 9 a.m. They'll be discussing opportunities to work abroad in Australia, New Zealand and Dubai, as well as the nitty-gritty details like visas.
Thanks for listening, and good luck to those considering an international career in speech and language therapy.
Bye!